Hey everyone, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Donnelly.
I'm Dr. Hinson.
And we welcome you back to continuing coverage of content regarding Pride Month. Yay,
Woo!
Pride Month! This movie that we're talking about today and next week's movie are both the kind of crappier sides of this conversation. The dealing a little bit more with some of the realities versus some of the celebrations, which others are a part of. So today we're talking about the HBO movie docudrama And the Band Played On, which was released in 92 and stars nearly every famous human being in 1992.
Everyone you could possibly think from the late 80s and early 90s in television and film.
Yeah, largely. I mean, like Matthew Modine is our main person into this.
And
classic. Could you give me a more 80s and 90s name than Matthew Modine? It's based on a book by Randy Schitz, which is a hefty one. It's about 600 pages. But what Randy does in that book, it doesn't read like 600 pages, I'll be honest, is he traces the epidemiological history of HIV. So the first actually known case of what we will come to know of as HIV is in a Copenhagen hospital in 1977. And from there's another case in France in 1978. There's another, it just kind of keeps growing.
And then the first case in the U.S. I think identified was in 1980 maybe?
Yeah.
From the film, yeah.
In San Francisco.
Yes.
And so the film chronicles the fight of the CDC to get this thing a name, a test, funding, anything.
I identified at what was going on. Like that was for me what was so instructive that I didn't really even know was how difficult it was to discover just what was happening to these people. Because a lot of the cases presented as people like pneumocystis, so like disease of the lungs, that people shouldn't be dying from. So a lot of people were dying from diseases that don't kill people, but their immune system was so suppressed because of this virus, but they had no idea what it was. And I didn't know that like, so even just, it was fascinating to see how you discover what is killing people, whether or not it's a new virus, how it's doing what it's doing to the human body. So
yeah, like a lot of people died from cat leukemia. Sure.
Yeah.
And at the same time, as they're kind of figuring out there's this thing that's killing people from things that shouldn't kill people. The gay community in San Francisco was very aware of Kaposi sarcoma, which was it's like a version of Legionnaire's disease, essentially. Like you grow these moles all over the place, and you eventually die because the moles grow other places than just your skin. And they were starting to fight for that. So you have some issues. Like it was one of the good reminders. Let me start over. Rewind. One of the really strong reminders in this movie is that there is no such thing as the gay community.
Yes.
There were a lot of people trying to speak for it as though it was a monolith, a homogeneous monolith, including, God love him, Ian McKellen.
Oh, bless.
But they were all wrong because any community is as vast and diverse as the people that make it up. And so there were men who sought their entire identity within the San Francisco bathhouses. And there were other men that thought the bathhouses were the worst parts of them and they needed to be shut down immediately. There were people who expressed their sexuality with a very bold stance. There were other people that were very never going to come out of the closet, and that was that. And every time somebody in the movie used the phrase gay community, I was like, which one? which one are you talking about?
And the difference in gay communities or, pockets of gay communities around cities and even around the world. So There's very, very different between what gay life looked like in San Francisco in the 1980s and what it looked like in Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles and some of the other centers of the original virus when it first started. Life looks very, very different for people in all of those places, and their expressions of their sexuality, as Dr. Donnelly said, very, very different.
So what we know of is the guy that we kind of refer to as patient zero when we talk about the epidemic, is a French-Canadian flight attendant who had, in the movie, he says over 250 men a year.
And that was a low estimate.
That was a low estimate. In the books and some other articles I've read, he finally estimated that he had an average like somewhere an average of 40 sexual partners a week. So he was, like, they did a great map. If you also, let me say, if you know nothing about epidemiology, this is also just a really great movie,
yes,
because it really breaks it down to like how they solve this puzzle.
How diseases spread,
how we find out about them, what it looks like. And so once we had patient zero, once they got that, then things kind of go. That's the case for nearly every kind of outbreak. Like that's the case. That was the case for Ebola all the times. It was the case for West Nile. It was the case for Zika. Once they can figure out the patient zero, then they can generally figure out how it's being transmitted. In the beginning, we knew that AIDS was being transmitted through semen. We didn't know that it was also transmitted through blood or saliva. There was a little bit where people thought it was airborne. There was a little bit where, all this kind of stuff. And the real problem with it showing up in the 1980s as a cross-section, sociologically, this disease showed up predominantly in gay men at the same time as the Reagan administration was doing quite a lot of work to keep any discriminatory laws regarding sexuality kind of in place. So the Reagan administration was not particularly interested in talking about AIDS. Very famously, President Reagan didn't even say the word out loud until his second term.
1988.
And they kept slashing funding for the NIH and things like that. It was not a really great time for a disease affecting a population that many in the Reagan administration didn't believe should have civil rights to pop up.
And so the film does I thought, a really great job of juxtaposing those things that are happening. The group of the CDC researchers who are legitimately just trying to find out what's happening and how the disease is being transmitted, and the severe, severe stigmas facing gay men. And we just were watching it, and they just kept referring to it as, oh, it's transmitted by gay sex, gay sex, gay sex. And we're like, don't you mean like sex? If it's transmitted by semen, then it's transmitted by sex.
This appeared to be confounding.
But they didn't have women presenting with the disease. And
then the first women they had presented as IV drug users.
Or as people with blood transfusion.
Yeah.
And so for a long time, it still wasn't on the radar of these clinical doctors that it was transmitted. But for me, I was just like, but if you know it's through semen, why aren't you looking for women in sex? It's transmitted by sex.
It's transmitted by bodily fluids.
Yeah.
So if you are unfamiliar with AIDS, just like let's throw that out there.
But that was one of the big markers for me of the bias and discrimination facing all of these queer people that were being impacted by the disease, right? Is that the stigmatization was that the disease was a result of this. The word they used to describe it was lifestyle. Which
is where you get a lot of the narratives about punishment. It's where you get a lot of the narratives. It was called gay cancer for a little while at first.
Yeah.
And some of the, like looking back now, hindsight is 2020, right? Like a lot of the messaging that many gay activists were using to get the word out about the cancer shot themselves in the foot later. In order to get funding and kind of this mess. And at the same time, you have the blood industry, which, believe it or not, is one.
It's an industry
that knew that that blood was tainted, but it was going to cost them too much money to test the blood. And very, very famously, there's a scene where Matthew Modine loses his temper at a public meeting, which is a verbatim transcript of a meeting that actually happened, who essentially says, like, could you just let us know the number of people that have to die before it becomes cost effective for you? And we won't bother you again till we get to that number.
Yeah, just give us a number. We'll stop shouting at you to test the blood.
Yeah.
But what is it? Like 100, 2,000, 5,000? Like, what's the number?
Which then also, I think us as individual citizens who don't make decisions, it was interesting to sit there and be like, but those are the numbers that these people are dealing with. Like, when you are the head of Johnson & Johnson, you're not thinking of this person who lives at 145 Elm Street who's dying of this disease. You're looking at cost projection analyses. And when we started turning healthcare into a business way back in the year of our Lord 1000 AD, pretty much. I mean, it's been that way forever. But when keeping people alive became a money-making venture, or a money loss adventure. This is kind of some of the stuff that came. So
you lose the empathy, the inherent empathy of just caring for people who are sick and dying.
But also the realities of running a company, and what does that look like? And like, you really, really want to be judgy, and it's really easy to be judgy, but at the same time, like, these people didn't know what was going on either. And no one could tell them if there was a test to test it. And they like, okay, so we have a terrible time getting blood anyway. You're going to tell us to throw out 400,000 liters that could save someone's life because 1 liter might give somebody this disease that we don't even know if it kills everybody. Like, you can understand why everything was really, really complicated. And also the incredible importance of the National Institute of Public Health, from my perspective, is that we as Americans are really bad about communicating facts without emotional hysteria, just as our media, just full stop. So even once it got diagnosed and got stuff, they had a horrible time getting information out about it. Like, this is true and this is false, because we just don't have the infrastructure in the way that some other nations did. The narrative around AIDS in the UK, for instance, and the narrative around AIDS in Germany and Canada are very different than the narrative around AIDS in the United States.
And that's the focus of this movie is really what within the United States and what was going on. The movie itself is really like chronological, very, very clinical in terms of representation of queer identities, of LGBTQ plus identities. They don't really go into it. That's not necessarily the point of the story.
But there are lots and lots of voices from different pockets. We just don't get to know them very well.
We don't get to know those pockets, and because the focus of the movie is on, how did we discover AIDS and HIV, not necessarily representing these voices. They do show, I think particularly in San Francisco, they do a good job of, or they do a decent job of showing the difficulty, particularly with the bathhouses that I knew absolutely nothing about, and the different cultures in gay life in San Francisco in the 1980s, and all the voices trying to be heard in this conversation and to understand what was happening. So that's not necessarily what the movie is about, but in terms of, a discussion of the AIDS crisis,
which
you couldn't find a better one for my money. If you want to understand really the history of the disease and the toll that it very quickly started to take on people in the United States and around the world. And at the end, it was interesting. Clearly, the movie was filmed in 1993, but at the end, they talk about some things that happened after that. So they clearly added kind of a postscript to the end of the movie to talk about further progression with the disease and some of the larger numbers. It looks like it was around 1998, 99, because that's the last date referenced. But they did give an update as well to let you know kind of what the 90s looked like for AIDS as well.
Just for instance, it's more likely now for a woman to contract AIDS than a man. Globally, we have about 60% of women who contract it. It's most likely to be contracted in developing nations by sexual assault or through poor treatment, poor tool management during childbirth. IV drug use is the lowest way to contract it, but it is still about, the last time I checked, about 20% of global cases. It knows absolutely no demographic. It doesn't care. It is one of the reasons why sterilization of medical materials is so incredibly important. One of the very main reasons. And again, if you're not super familiar, HIV is the virus that you get. People can live with HIV for up to 50, 60 years in some cases we've seen. HIV has been reversed. People have been cured from HIV. Once HIV mutates into the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, so far that is pretty much still a 100% death sentence. But you never die from AIDS. You die from another disease. And so there's also the conversation about what coroners put on people's death records and how did we have this conversation and what does this look like, and powerful people and everything else.
And honestly, if you didn't know what the disease was, they listed cause of death as cause of death. And so that was a huge problem initially in just finding people who had died from AIDS because their cause of death was listed as leukemia, cancer, lung disease, pneumonia, like all of these things, because that is what killed them. But it was because of that syndrome that allowed for that. So that was a huge problem too. But
so if you're not familiar with AIDS activism, or you think that we're kind of done with it, I meet a lot of people who think we are. I would really encourage you to watch this flick, and then go down some rabbit trails.
And then watch Rent.
And then watch Rent to get a very, very intimate portrait of what life looked like for people in the early 90s regarding that. And then after that, the culture kind of stopped talking about it for a little while.
For a long time, yeah.
We'll talk about that in a couple more videos. So for now, that's all from us. I'm Dr. Donnelly.
I'm Dr. Hinson.
We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research, and we'll see you next time to talk about the Laramie Project.
Bye.
Bye.